Shalom everyone, you're all here for Hebrew in Israel. Thank you for joining me again. And today I want to talk about the subject of alphabets. And today's focus will be on the Samaritan alphabet because it is a very unique alphabet that's used for Hebrew. And it's a niche alphabet because a very, very small group of people actually use it to this very day. And before we even touch on the subject of the Samaritan alphabet, we first of all have to discuss the question of who are the Samaritans and how did this alphabet actually come into existence? And also maybe a few notes about Samaritan Hebrew. So first of all, who are the Samaritans? If you ask a Samaritan who they are, they will tell you, we are the descendants of the original 10 tribes. We are from the north, and we've always been here. We hold the true interpretation of the Torah, the true version of the Torah, and they perceive Jews as their brothers. They say, yeah, Judah, our brother, and so on. But the narrative that runs through their understanding of things, and I say the word narrative deliberately because we have to talk about this concept, their narrative is that they are the descendants of the 10 tribes, and they've always been here. They never really went into exile. Maybe some of them did, but they've always been here. The Samaritans have a very, very complicated history, and today there are very, very few of them. It's less than 1,000 people. Maybe they've crossed 1,000, but last time I checked, it was in the hundreds, and that's because the Turks massacred them. When people talk about the genocide and so on, one of the first real genocides of the modern times is the genocide of the Samaritan community. By medieval times, there were over 1 million Samaritans, and they were basically killed in different situations. But there was the Ottoman Empire did go out of its way to murder a lot of them, and in the early 20th century, if I'm not mistaken, there was a huge massacre, and they almost got wiped off of the face of the earth. There was only like 100 and something of them left out of thousands upon thousands. It's a very, very, very sad story. And to this very day, they have not survived. They have not been able to recover from the reality of losing so many people. Where the Samaritans actually come from? Well, when you open the Book of Kings, it tells us that the northern tribes were exiled, and the Assyrians did what's called the double-sided or the two-way exiling system. It's a well-known, well-established concept in history of the Assyrian Empire, where they would take a group, move it from one place to the other, and take the original group and move them somewhere else. This was basically playing match up with different groups in different places, and the purpose was to create a lack of morale. When you are forced to live in a different place from your home, and you don't have the prospect of even returning to your original home because of the fact that someone else lives there, you lose the interest in rebelling. Even though this doesn't mean the Assyrians didn't deal with rebellions, but most of their rebellions usually came from cultures who lived on their original homeland. So the Book of Kings tells us they were exiled. But if you look very, very closely at the Book of Kings, it also points out that the land wasn't completely empty. And Oded Lifshitz, for example, has challenged this interpretation that the land was empty, and he has a whole lecture in English. Unfortunately, back then, Oded had a much more heavy Israeli accent. Recently, I met him in a conference on Yahwism under the Achmenide Empire. It was a very, very intensive conference. I was one of the workers there, and I got to rub shoulders with a lot of the researchers. So today he has a much better accent. And by the way, just to plug in, wonderful bunch of lectures. My friend Dr. Gad Barnea was the man who organized this, and there actually is a YouTube channel which I will be sharing onto Patreon and on Facebook and wherever I can. Maybe even I'll be able to cross-share off of YouTube. Very, very interesting things, lots of interesting lecturers. Again, not from a religious perspective, so there are a lot of things which are said there which many people from a religious or from a faith-based point of view will feel uncomfortable with, but I think that still there's a lot to learn from there. And for me as an academic, I'm used to it, but for people who may feel a bit more sensitive, they might have some disturbing statements there, but essentially a very, very important discussions there, especially the fact that we find people with Yeho or Yahu prefix and suffix, theophoric prefixes and suffixes for names which show us that there were people from all over the place that believe in the God of Israel and therefore from different areas in the world and overall. So what's very interesting about the whole thing is that we know that there were people who worshiped the God of Israel beyond Judah. This is fact. I mean, this is said explicitly in the Bible. But this may actually extend beyond even the 10 tribes. So what's very interesting is that when you read the book of Kings, it actually tells you that they brought people to live in Samaria. Now, it doesn't mean they brought people to live in the entire northern kingdom. And this is what Oded Lipschitz points out in articles that he's written and in, I think it's a book that he even wrote. I think I have the book on my shelf somewhere. And I'm really hoping he'll redo the lecture because his English has seriously improved throughout the years. But if he hasn't, it's still understandable. And he challenges the whole idea the land was empty. So when we ask where the Samaritans are from, the answer, I think, the fairest answer has to be that they are a mixture of people who remain from the northern tribes, because when you read very, very carefully, the land was not empty. Part of Naphtali, part of Dan, maybe parts of Asher were exiled, and we know as the fact that in, for example, the city of Esarhaddon, there were people there who were Judeans who were exiled. We know that there is Tel El Yehudu, there were Jews or Judeans who lived there. We also know that many of the northern tribers, probably thousands of them, fled to Jerusalem and lived in Jerusalem during the times of King Hezekiah, because we can see the expansion to the western hill, which is where the Jewish quarter is, the Armenian quarter is, and it's even beyond the walls that we see today. There was a less settled area that raises the question of, is it possible that there were tents there, not actual houses? And the understanding is that this wasn't just people from Judea fleeing into Jerusalem. These were northerners fleeing to Jerusalem as well. This is why you have to say that Jews today are not composed only from Judah. The term Jew comes from a Roman concept that they identified people who were of Israelite descent as Jews because of the affiliation with Judea, because by that point, by the Roman era, everyone faced Jerusalem. Everyone, even in Babylon, in Egypt, everyone faced towards Jerusalem. So there was this sense that Judea is like the homeland, even though there were lots of people living in the Galilee and in the plains and so on. And those who lived in the Galilee could have actually been descendants of the 10 tribes as well. There's no actual evidence, real evidence that the land was empty. There's evidence that there was exile. We're talking about over 250,000 people were exiled into the east. But it doesn't mean that everything was completely empty, to a point where we actually have villages up in the north. I think there's one village about 40-minute drive away from where I live that was abandoned and then resettled just about half a mile down the road from the original site. And it was built very similar to the original village, which means that whomever lived there fled and then went back. So there's no reason to believe that there's a concept of the 10 lost tribes. I actually object to this concept. It's part of what I would call Jewish mythology, and this may be an idea for a podcast, Jewish mythology, or Jewish legends and things like that. It's an idea. Vote if you want me to do such a program. And the occupants that came from the outside were probably also in the thousands, but remember, they had to march all the way from the east. These were people who came from basically Iran and Iraq of today and Afghanistan, and they had to march all the way there. So there's a limit of how many you can actually exile. Even the 250,000 that's described, we're talking about over a period of several decades being exiled. Same thing with Jerusalem. We have this very large number, or Judea, we have this very large number, but this was probably over a period of several years before they actually were able to fill up this number. So these are things that probably happened over a period of time. And what we end up with is a group that's probably predominantly Israelite, which means they speak Hebrew, and a small group of people that eventually assimilate into the larger group of northerners, and maybe even eventually Judeans as well, because we know people traveled. When Judea was destroyed, they started moving maybe up north. We know the area of Faust, for example, Avraham Faust, who's an archaeologist, demonstrated that north of Jerusalem in the Benjamite areas, the land wasn't torn, it wasn't destroyed, so it was easy to travel north and to a much more healthy area in the land so you can actually survive. And what you end up with is a mixture of northerners, external people that were exiled to the northern cities, Samaria and satellite cities, and probably Judeans, especially if you accept what Josephus says, that Judeans during the Second Temple, during the time of Yadua III, I think this was the high priest, Yadua, somewhere around the 4th century, I think it was, they traveled, some of them intermarried with this northern group, and Mount Gerizim became their center, maybe much earlier than that even, and this was a mixture of also Judeans within this specific group. So that's probably what the Samaritans come from. And the Samaritans, what they did is they developed all their culture around Mount Gerizim, and this is why their version of the biblical text of the Pentateuch mentions Mount Gerizim. Like, for example, in the Ten Commandments, there's a whole section there that's copied from the book of Deuteronomy. It's a harmonization method, and we can talk about the Samaritan Pentateuch, but what I really want to do with the Samaritan Pentateuch is I actually want to invite a friend of mine that's her field of expertise, Dr. Hila Daifani, if she is willing. I don't know. She's a very, very busy researcher, but if she is willing, it will be very, very nice to bring her in and even do, like, for example, a Zoom a meeting with her or something, and just let her talk about it, even for 20 minutes, half an hour, just talk about it, the whole thing. I am planning on talking with several friends of mine who are researchers. It's a very, very important thing to do because you're bringing someone that knows a lot more than you do on a certain topic. But they have their own version, and based on what I've seen in different researchers, like, for example, Orlik, for example, Eugene Orlik has a very interesting description about this. There's a French researcher that I never remember his name, but his name is Michel Langlois or something like that. He wrote a whole book about the subject. Actually, no, it's a collection of researches. It's called the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Dead Sea Scrolls. Also very interesting. I got to meet him face to face. Very nice man. This is his area. And also what Dr. Daifani said to me was that the Samaritan Pentateuch is not completely separate from, well, it's a separate text, not completely separate from what we would call the Proto-Masoretic, but it's a separate text. And we can't really say that it branched off from the Masoretic text. That's the understanding today, that it didn't branch off, because when we look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have versions not written in Samaritan script, by the way, written in square letters or in Paleo Hebrew. And if I'm not mistaken, Dr. Daifani's work has to do with the subject of the calligraphy and how variations of calligraphy affect the way people read their text, which explains why we have variations of spelling and even entire words, because if you write something one way and you did do it a little bit different than what someone else is used to, they might decide it's a different word. Also, you have to remember that the Pentateuch was originally written in Paleo Hebrew, and then it developed into the square letters and so on. But that's where the split happened. The Samaritans decided to use the old script, while the Judeans decided to use the new script. There's a question: how was this introduced? Was it a one-go process, like the rabbinic literature says, or was it a slow process, which is what historians say, which probably is the correct description? And these northerners developed this new north group of people, developed their own literature. They developed their own version of the Pentateuch, which is extremely similar to the Pentateuch, the Judean Pentateuch. There's also a Pentateuch in Egypt, which eventually evolves into what we call the Septuagint, the Old Greek Septuagint. And they differ from one another in like words, and sometimes there's like these cases where there's an entire section, like the Samaritan, there's harmonization. They copy a piece from Deuteronomy, put it in Exodus, from Exodus put it in Deuteronomy about the Passover, about the Ten Commandments that contain a whole description of building an altar in Mount Gerizim, focusing on Mount Gerizim instead of Mount Eval in the book of Deuteronomy and things like that. And then there's like little versions that differ, differentiate the Samaritan and the Greek from the Hebrew and so on. And so it's very difficult to say what's the original. Today, the attitude is that there's no original. This is what Professor Kratz said to me quite a few years back. This is Reinhard Kratz, big name in biblical studies and especially Dead Sea Scroll research. And he said to me, don't even try to look for an original. It's very difficult to put your finger on an original. We can see baseline concepts, but you can't really talk about an original and say this is, now I found. So there was this guy years ago who said he wants to try to produce like this harmonized version where he takes all three texts and he tries to create the one text where two agree on something and the third says something else, so you end up with a different text. You end up with a harmonized text where if two agree, then the third one is irrelevant. But again, that doesn't prove that this is the way you actually do it. It's an issue. It's an issue to do that. And there's a huge methodological problem with this because you have to also prove from context and so on, and understand where this version came from and stuff like that. So it's very difficult to even say any of it. But in any case, what happens is the Samaritans break off eventually because of the war with the Judeans, especially because the Judeans, Yonatan, I think it was Yonatan Holkin, also one of the Hasmoneans decides to destroy the temple of Mount Gerizim. The Judah the Maccabee, actually in the book of Maccabees, there is a reference to Mount Gerizim in a positive sense. It's a holy site. It's kind of interesting to see that because everyone says that the Hasmoneans hated the Samaritans because Hasmoneans wanted a temple in Jerusalem, only in Jerusalem. But this doesn't seem to be the case. They weren't bothered by the concept of a temple, Mount Gerizim, until one of the descendants, I think it was the third king or something like that, he decided to destroy the temple, Mount Gerizim, even though it was sanctioned and so on. So when we read the book of Ezra, we also have a description there of these enemies and so on, but these seem to be more of a group that was living on the eastern side of the river. This was more about competition about Jerusalem. This was also someone, Sanvelat, and there was like 9 or 13 of them. I can't remember exactly. It was a whole slew of people called Sanvelat. This was like a name that passed on from one generation to the other. Sanvelat, the Charonite, goes to war, has a conflict with Ezra and Nehemiah, but it doesn't really matter. The point is that we're reading these things also from a political point of view. The Samaritans themselves are just a group of people that were worshippers of the God of Israel. They spoke a dialect of Hebrew, which is frozen to this very day, and we'll talk about that as well. And what they did, their calligraphy, now we're getting to the crux of things, their calligraphy is actually a frozen version of a calligraphy that was discovered in Judea as well, of an evolution from Paleo Hebrew into this format. Now, as you can see on the screen, and as has been hovering on the screen for over 18 minutes, but you probably took a moment to look at this, and when you look at the screen, you can see on the left, the modern or Hebrew square letters that we use today, which was probably introduced somewhere in the 5th or 4th centuries BCE. You can see the Paleo Hebrew. There are lots of types of Paleo Hebrew, by the way. It doesn't really end there. There's like different styles that were discovered. If you're study calligraphy, you'll see that in some places they wrote one way, in other places they wrote other way. So you can identify the period of when something was written based on the style of writing. And I will do a thing about the alphabet as well. There'll be a whole discussion about the alphabet. And then you can see different styles of how they wrote in majestic writings or majuscule, which is basically official, nicer, written alphabet that they'll use like in a Torah scroll, especially number 2 here. It's the most common one you would see, but these are also found in other ways of writing. And then there's the minuscule, which is usually what you would find when they write something which is not a big important text. This is true, by the way, for Dead Sea Scrolls as well, and also writing in overall anywhere. I mean, if you're writing something official, you usually have a calligrapher that writes really nice and so on. And this is not necessarily the case in some of the when you write a regular letter, or when someone's just writing something to themselves, they're not a professional scribe and so on. And this is why even in Dead Sea Scrolls there's this difference between scrolls which are written in like a very, very low grade versus scrolls which are written really high grade, and then everything in between. And also there's periods in Dead Sea Scrolls as well. You can identify how they wrote, based the period based on how they wrote. And what we have here is basically there was a split that happened at some point. But even in Judea, up to the Bar Kokhba revolt, we still see Paleo Hebrew, a variation of Paleo Hebrew, not the Samaritan Paleo Hebrew, but the older Paleo Hebrew on coins that were discovered from the Bar Kokhba revolt from around the year 132 to 135 to the Common Era, which means Jews didn't completely abandon Paleo Hebrew until much, much later. The choice of abandoning Paleo Hebrew seems to be as part of a response to the Samaritans, because when we look at even the Hasmonean coins, which the Bar Kokhba coins were a copy of, they also used Paleo Hebrew. And even during the Great Revolt, they used Paleo Hebrew. So it seems to be that there were two things going on here. One seems to be some kind of like a reminiscing over the older script, but not the Samaritan, avoiding the Samaritan script, because the Samaritans by this point became the enemy. And second of all, there seems to be maybe some kind of an avoidance of using square letters, maybe because the square letters were more associated by this point with scrolls, with Torah scrolls and so on. So there was a sense that you can actually have a script that's no longer used for holy materials or holy scripture, so you can drop that and use the Paleo Hebrew for other things, and then you use the square letters only for your holy books. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, by the way, there are places where we find, for example, the name of God, the Tetragrammaton written in Paleo Hebrew and not in square letters, and there's a whole debate. Is this because they're treating the square letters as holier, or is it the other way around? They want to write the name in its original form. It's a very interesting thing. You can see in different scrolls. Also, some scrolls, they don't write the name, they just put 4 dots because they're avoiding writing the name. And that actually might be a practice that may explain why they're writing in Paleo Hebrew. They don't want to write the name in the proper form by that point. Whatever the case may be, we have Jews using Paleo Hebrew, but we do find Samaritan Hebrew, a Samaritan alphabet, in a few locations within Judea. And for example, there's a tomb of one of the Hasmoneans, a tomb from the 2nd century, where there is an inscription, and you can see this inscription in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, and it's written in this type of alphabet, in the Samaritan alphabet. So it shows that this alphabet developed within Judea and Samaria at the same time, but eventually there's a break-off. Now, rabbinic literature says that the Samaritans were the enemy from the get-go, from times of Ezra and Nehemiah, and therefore there was a decision made that we're no longer using Paleo Hebrew, and we're switching to square letters, and Ezra is perceived as some kind of the new giver of the Torah, and therefore he gave the Torah again in a new script or something like that. And then there's another place where it says that Jews and Samaritans decided to split off, so the Samaritans took Aramaic and they wrote in Paleo Hebrew, while Jews took Hebrew and wrote in Aramaic script. None of this is actually true. This was a mixture. People were using this, using that. But what's very clear is that the reason in Judea they used square letters is because of the fact that the square letters were institutionalized by the scribes. Scribes have a lot of power, even to this very day, about making decisions how things are done. And I'll expand upon this on the alphabet discussion in another video. But what we do get here is a very interesting reality where Judeans are switching to square letters, still using Paleo Hebrew. Paleo Hebrew is a descendant of Proto-Sinaitic, and Proto-Sinaitic is a somewhat pictographic, but uses an alphabet. It's very important. I have a whole discussion about this I did years ago. It is not hieroglyphs. I have a speech impediment, so saying hieroglyphs or something, it's difficult for me. So I apologize if I mispronounce it. It's just something I can't say. It's one of those words I just can't say properly. Hieroglyphim. That's how we say it in Hebrew. And it's because the R and the L next to one another, the motion with the tongue happens. And they're used as actual alphabet. I actually went to an Egyptologist who teaches hieroglyphs, and he said to me, "No, you can't read this as hieroglyphs. This is an alphabet." And he showed me examples of how it's used as an alphabet. The Paleo Hebrew evolved more and more and more, but we can see it's an alphabet. So eventually we have Paleo Hebrew in the 8th century, proper Paleo Hebrew. It moves from Proto-Sinaitic to Proto-Canaanite to Paleo Hebrew, which eventually evolves into the square letters, and we'll talk about this in another discussion. And eventually, somewhere around the 2nd century, we get this type of alphabet. So this is just about images. I mean, we have to talk about also how they pronounce this. But basically, you kind of can see in a lot of places how, Aleph, kind of the same if you move things around. Bet, very similar. Gimel, very similar. Dalet, very similar. Hey, very similar. But because we have inscriptions and we can see the evolution, we can kind of pinpoint when the Samaritans broke off. But this was a slow evolving thing. In Judea, there were people using all 3 types of script, and eventually a war broke out between the 2 groups. So this was more of now it became an ethnic thing. We no longer use this, what's eventually become Samaritan alphabet. We're going to be using either Paleo Hebrew or more preferably square letters. But by the way, this doesn't mean that people didn't use the Samaritan Pentateuch. We find Samaritan Pentateuch variations or Proto-Samaritan Pentateuch in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It was still considered to be a legitimate type of text. It just was written in a different alphabet. And you can see Vav kind of evolves and so on. Eventually, some of these are very difficult to identify. I would say that, for example, Zayin is very, very difficult to identify. Het, kind of similar. Tet almost kind of looks like the tet we use today. It's very, very similar. This was a circle with an X. Yud, completely different. By the way, Yud, because it has like a little thing here. Yud is just a line, very, very simple line. This is why they say Kotzosh of Yud. I think there's a place where it says something about a iota, and that's really what it's talking about. It's like a Yud is not just a line, it's like a line with a little knob on it. Kaf, kind of similar, actually kind of similar on both ends. Lamed, facing this way, the Jewish Lamed faces the other way, faces this way. Mem, kind of, not really. It is important, by the way, there is a final mem, and we'll talk about that in the alphabet discussion, and you'll see that there's some interesting history there. But you can pretty much see this whole alphabet here. Some of them are similar, some of them change. Like, for example, Samech, completely different. I would argue completely different all ends. Ayin, very similar in Paleo and Samaritan, but the Ayin in Jewish is different. Pei, kind of, not really. Tzadi, Samaritan, very similar. Jewish script, not. Kuf, across the board, quite similar. Reish, quite similar. Shin, very similar. Tav, interesting. The Jewish Tav looks more like the Paleo, while the Samaritan Tav starts looking like an N and so on. They have the same amount of letters in their alphabet. They don't have final forms. These are letters we use at the end. Kaf, Mem, Nun, Pei, and Tzadi are used at the end. But we'll talk about those in another discussion. And what's very interesting is you also have the names Alaf, Bit, Gaman, Dalat, very, very similar. But what happened with Samaritan Hebrew is, first of all, the Samaritans to this very day, they actually speak, and this is a phenomenal thing, they actually speak a dialect of Hebrew. It's very, very similar to what they spoke back then, which means it froze in time as well. But what it also includes are very particular changes within the dialect that show us that this is an older dialect. And one of them is the fact that they don't really have proper gutturals. This is called guttural erosion. This happens in lots of Semitic languages. What's fascinating is that Jewish Hebrew, specifically Masoretic Hebrew, but Jewish Hebrew across the board, protected its gutturals as well. Today, Ashkenaz Jews, for example, have difficulty pronouncing chet and ayin, and also uval and yuval sounds, to and qa, were lost on Ashkenaz Jews. But up to about 300 years ago, we actually have references to Jews in different communities in Europe that still vocalize these things properly. But living in European countries, it affected the way people spoke, and we have to talk about that as well. Again, all referencing to a future video about the alphabet. And what's very interesting about this is that we see the guttural erosion of the Second Temple that appears sometimes in the Dead Sea Scrolls emerge again within the Samaritan Hebrew. So, for example, letters like he, which is a h sound, they say e. They don't have a h properly. They also don't have a het. They say it, as you can see here. E, it. Also, their vav morphs into a ba, which kind of probably indicates it was originally a wa, at least in their dialect. They say, tit, tet, yut, yud, kaf, labat, lamed, mim, nun, samech, singat. There's a whole discussion about samech, how to pronounce it properly, but it's another discussion. Fi, they don't have pe. It's actually probably an influence from Arabic. Saddiya, qof, rish, shan. Doesn't seem that they have a sa, a sin. And what's very interesting is ayn, they say in. They don't have ayn. And when I actually listened to recordings of Samaritans reading Pentateuchal lines, for example, the Shema, in Hebrew say Shema Yisrael, Adonai Elohenu, Adonai Echad. Okay, or you can replace Adonai with Yud He Vav He, whatever you prefer to read. And they say Shema Yisrael, Shema, not Shama, Shema. Also, they don't have the concept of vocal shva. That's something that's more Judean Hebrew. We'll talk about that in the vowel points discussion. So they don't say, they say Israel, something like that. They said influence from the Arabic. Shama Eloinu. Shama. They don't say, Shama is an Aramaic version of the name Hashem. Shama Shem. That's the at the end is the Aramaic definite articles. Like we say Hashem, the name. Shama is the name as well. They don't even say Adonai, they just say name. And they say Shama, which is the Aramaic. This is where we find this whole discussion that in rabbinic literature, the Samaritans chose Aramaic as their language. It is true, there is a lot of Aramaic literature amongst them, but Jews did the same thing as well. But their Torah was never written in Aramaic. It's I don't know where that comes from, but I think there is an Aramaic translation, a Samaritan Aramaic translation of the Hebrew Bible, an Arabic translation, but not. There's no official Aramaic. I actually have a copy of the official Samaritan Pentateuch, and it's written in Hebrew. It's Samaritan Alphabet, but written in Hebrew. Then they say Eloinu. Okay, it's because E. It's Hey is identified. If it's just a consonant, it's an E. Now this has to do with the difference between A and E. It's another discussion about vowel points that we'll have. But for them, E and A are very, very close to one another, so there's no big difference. But they say Eloinu. They don't say Elohenu or Elohinu. They don't have the Hey. Akkadian does the same thing. It says Idlu instead of Elohim and so on. Idlum. Shamma Ad. Okay, Shamma, again, the name, Ad. They don't say Ehad, they say Ad. Why? Because they're skipping the Het. So there's no Ayin and there's no Het. And when you actually listen to the recordings, you can see they constantly drop Het and Ayin because they don't have this in their vocalization. It doesn't mean they can't vocalize it, because most of them speak Arabic. So they have 30 odd letters that they can pronounce. You can do and and so on. Sounds that we don't necessarily have in Hebrew today. Again, another discussion about the alphabet. We'll get to that. But the very intriguing thing here is the fact that their Hebrew is completely frozen in time. And they insist on freezing it even though they don't have to. But this is their tradition. So it's absolutely fascinating. We see an alphabet frozen in time. We see a dialect of Hebrew frozen in time, which is very similar to things that we can identify in the Hebrew of certain groups within the Second Temple era. They continue doing a Passover. They have ruins of a temple. They kind of adopted a lot of stuff from Judaism. They believe in some kind of a coming of a Messiah, even though they don't have a Bible. They only have a Pentateuch and some short version of Book of Joshua. It's kind of like their history. It's a piece that's added to their Pentateuch. They had a temple. They're not rebuilding it. They're waiting for someone to build it. And they have a lot of their own interpretations of how the Torah is to be kept. But it is absolutely fascinating as a person, especially a person who deals with languages and Semitic languages and Hebrew particularly. It's absolutely fascinating to see this, and they have their own vowel points, their own vowel point markers as well, and I'll discuss that in a vowel point class that I'll do here. And it's absolutely fascinating. But what's really interesting is just to see how they preserved their their traditions, and it's literally frozen in time. They still have a high priest that they have to elect when the next one passes away. They have a sacrificial site that they go to. It's just absolutely fascinating to see this group. They don't have the conventions of Judaism. They didn't go through all the concepts of Judaism, but they do have their own philosophy. But that's more of a general thing that you can find in the general world. Absolutely fascinating. So anyhow, this was Samaritan Alphabet. A lot of Samaritan history here as well, because you need to understand where they come from, because script becomes part of identity. This is why I gave the whole introduction. Script and language is part of identity. And this was very important to them. It's very important for Jews today as well. We insist on using the square letters. We insist on doing certain things in a certain way. We insist on speaking Hebrew in a very specific way. They insist on speaking a different way. And it's all to do with identity. It's when language becomes culture, and culture becomes a weapon for you to present yourself as different than the others. Hope you enjoyed this, and I hope that I'll be able to do more videos like this. And again, requests, if there's anything you're interested in. Remember, I'm only posting this for my Patreons, so if there's anything particular you want, this is your opportunity to ask. Thank you for joining me again, and I will see you in the next video.